The large concert hall was filled with the soft hum of expensive conversations and the rustling of silk clothes. It was a special night for the city because people from high society had gathered there to show off their wealth and their taste in fine art. The air inside the room felt heavy and thick with the scent of rich perfumes and polished leather. Every single person in the audience looked like they had stepped out of a fashion magazine. The men wore dark suits that fit them perfectly, and the women sparkled in jewelry that cost more than a regular person earns in a lifetime. They sat in velvet chairs, sipping champagne and glancing at their gold watches, wondering when the real entertainment would begin. Nobody was paying attention to the back of the hall, where the heavy wooden doors stood like guards against the outside world. They were too busy looking at each other and whispering about who had the biggest diamond ring or the fastest car. Suddenly, the grand doors groaned open, and the sound cut through the low buzz of the room like a sharp knife. Every head near the back turned to see who was entering late. In the doorway stood a woman who looked completely out of place among all the glitz and glamour. She appeared to be in her later years, with hair the color of dull iron pulled back into a simple bun. Her face was lined with wrinkles that told stories of a hard life and many years of work. She was not wearing a sparkling gown or expensive jewelry. Instead, she was dressed in a very plain and worn coat that had seen better days. The fabric looked thin, and the color was a faded shade of blue that had washed out long ago. She carried a heavy cloth bag over one shoulder and held onto the strap with both hands as if it contained everything she owned in the world. A silence started to spread from the back of the room, moving forward like a cold wave. People stopped talking and stared openly at the stranger. Their eyes were not welcoming, but rather sharp and judgmental. It was clear that this woman did not belong in their world of luxury. A few men in expensive tuxedos nudged each other and smirked while pointing their fingers in her direction. A woman in the front row rolled her eyes and whispered loudly to her neighbor that the help must have gotten lost. Laughter bubbled up here and there. It was not a kind laughter, but a cruel one, meant to mock and belittle. They assumed she was a cleaning lady who had taken a wrong turn, or perhaps someone looking for a warm place to rest. No one looked at her with respect or curiosity. They only saw what she was wearing and decided they knew exactly who she was. The woman in the faded coat did not seem to notice the laughing eyes or the mean whispers. She kept her head held high, but her eyes looked straight ahead, focusing only on the stage at the far end of the room. She took a small step forward, and her shoes made a soft clicking sound on the marble floor. The shoes were old and scuffed. They were made for walking long distances on hard pavement, not for gliding across a concert hall floor. As she walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted slightly, as if her presence was something physical they needed to avoid. The smell of her old clothes mixed with the scent of expensive perfume, creating a strange contrast in the air. She walked with a slow and steady rhythm, ignoring the people on either side of her. She did not look left or right. She did not blush with embarrassment or shrink away from their gaze. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved that the arrogant audience completely failed to understand. The laughter grew a bit louder as she got closer to the stage, because the absurdity of the situation seemed to increase with every step she took. A young man near the front leaned over to his date and made a loud joke about a circus act coming to town. His date covered her mouth with a gloved hand and giggled. The ushers who stood at the sides looked at each other with confused shrugs, unsure if they should stop her or let her pass. They had never seen a regular person walk so confidently toward the stage of such a prestigious event. The tension in the room was rising. The audience felt that their exclusive evening was being ruined by this intruder. They wanted her to turn around and leave so they could go back to their safe bubble of wealth and perfection. They shifted in their seats and crossed their arms, preparing to boo or hiss if she tried to speak. She finally reached the stairs leading up to the large wooden stage and the grand piano that sat in the center of it. The piano was a massive beast of black polished wood, shining brightly under the spotlight. It looked majestic and intimidating. The woman paused at the bottom of the stairs and took a deep breath. For just a moment, her hand tightened on the strap of her bag. She looked at the instrument with a gaze that was hard to describe. It was not the look of a fan or a critic. It was the look of someone seeing a part of their own soul. The spotlights reflected off her tired face, and for a second she did not look like a poor old woman in a ragged coat. She looked like a warrior standing before a battle. The audience held their breath, waiting for her to realize her mistake and walk away in shame. But she did not turn around. She put one foot on the first step and began to climb. The heavy wooden stairs creaked softly under her worn shoes as she climbed up to the stage level one step at a time, with slow, deliberate movements. The spotlight from above followed her like a curious eye, illuminating every stray thread on her coat and every gray hair on her head. The contrast between her simple appearance and the shining grand piano waiting in the center of the stage was stark and almost painful to look at. It was like seeing a wild flower growing out of a crack in a concrete sidewalk. The audience watched in stunned disbelief as she reached the top platform and turned to face the sea of wealthy faces. A few people near the front actually stood up, thinking that surely this was a mistake, or perhaps a planned prank by the event organizers. They looked around for cameras, expecting a host to jump out and yell that they were on television. But the hall remained silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. She walked across the stage floor with her head held high, ignoring the hundreds of eyes burning into her back. She did not look like a performer. She did not have the confident stride of a concert pianist, nor the dramatic flair of a showman. She walked like a grandmother walking to her garden to check on her vegetables. When she finally reached the piano, she stopped and placed her heavy cloth bag on the floor with a soft thud. The sound seemed to echo through the microphone system and bounce off the high walls of the concert hall. A ripple of snickers moved through the crowd again. Someone in the back shouted out a rude comment about the bag being a lunch pail. Another voice asked if she was there to tune the instrument. The laughter grew bolder now. It was a mean laughter, born out of confusion and superiority. These people had paid a lot of money to see a show, and they felt like they were being treated as the butt of a joke. The woman leaned down and unzipped her bag slowly. The sound of the zipper teeth parting seemed loud in the quiet room. The audience leaned forward in their seats, collectively holding their breath to see what she would pull out. Would it be a cleaning rag? Would it be a sandwich? A hush fell over the crowd as her hands disappeared into the depths of the bag. Instead of a rag or food, she pulled out a small piece of dark cloth, which she used to wipe her hands with great care. She dried her palms and her fingers as if she were preparing for surgery. This small, strange act confused the people even more. They looked at each other with raised eyebrows and whispered that she must be crazy. After wiping her hands, she folded the cloth neatly and placed it on top of the piano. Then she turned her attention to the bench. The bench was a beautiful piece of polished wood upholstered in black leather, but it was clearly adjusted for someone much taller than her. She stood in front of it and looked down at the keys, then back at the seat. She reached for the handle to twist it and lower the height. It was stiff. She grunted softly with effort and pulled on the handle, but it did not budge. The audience watched this struggle with growing amusement. To them, it looked like a comedy sketch. Here was this old woman fighting with a piano bench in front of 1,000 well-dressed people. A few men started to clap slowly and sarcastically, egging her on as if she were an animal in a circus. The laughter swelled again, louder this time. It was a cacophony of disrespect. They were mocking her struggle. They were mocking her existence in their space. She finally managed to turn the handle a little bit, and the bench dropped with a sudden clang. She flinched slightly at the noise, but did not look up at the crowd. She adjusted the seat a bit more until it was at the right height for her small frame. Then she sat down. The leather squeaked under her weight as she settled herself. She wiggled a bit to get comfortable and smoothed out the front of her old coat. The sight was almost pathetic to the wealthy onlookers. A tiny, hunched figure in a ragged coat, sitting on a massive stage in front of a concert grand piano. It looked like a child trying to drive a bus. The mockery reached its peak. People were openly jeering now. They felt safe in their numbers. They felt sure that security would rush the stage any moment to escort her out. They were waiting for the interruption, but no security guards came. The lights did not change. The announcer did not return to the microphone. The woman sat there for a long moment looking at the black and white keys. She reached out with her right hand and hovered her fingers over the ivory. Her hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from age, or perhaps from the cold air in the room. The audience saw the tremor and laughed even harder. They pointed at her shaking hand and made cruel jokes about her needing a glass of water or a nap. They had completely written her off. In their minds, she was just a distraction, nuisance, a funny story they would tell at their dinner parties later that night. They could not have been more wrong. She placed her left foot on the gold pedal near the floor and shifted her weight one last time. The rustle of her clothes was the only sound in the vast hall. She took a deep breath that expanded her chest and lifted her shoulders slightly. For a split second, the laughter died down because there was something about the way she held herself that changed. The nervousness seemed to fall away. Her back straightened just a little bit. Her gaze focused intensely on the music stand in front of her, although there was no sheet music there. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The people who were laughing a moment ago suddenly felt a strange unease. It was the feeling of being in the presence of something they did not understand. The mocking smiles froze on their faces. The air in the room shifted from electric anticipation to a confused stillness. She was not looking at them. She was not looking for approval. She was only looking at the piano. Her hands hovered over the keys, ready to strike the first note. The crowd leaned in, waiting for the punchline of the joke, but the punchline was not coming. What was coming was something entirely different. The silence in the room stretched on like a tight rubber band ready to snap at any second. The woman took one final deep breath and closed her eyes for just a brief moment. When she opened them again, they were clear and sharp, and focused entirely on the black and white keys in front of her. She raised her hands high above the keyboard. The audience held their breath, expecting to hear a clumsy tune, or perhaps a simple childish melody. They prepared their polite claps for when she finished her embarrassing attempt. Some people even raised their phones to record a video to show their friends later how funny it was to see a grandmother on stage at such a fancy event. They were ready to laugh. Then her hands came down. They struck the keys with a force that seemed impossible for someone of her small size. A massive chord exploded from the piano. It was not a soft sound. It was a thunderclap. It shook the floorboards and seemed to rattle the windows of the grand hall. The sound was so loud and so deep that it physically moved the hair on the arms of the people in the front row. The laughter died instantly. It did not fade away gradually. It stopped as if someone had cut the power to a loudspeaker. The silence that followed the first chord was heavier than before. It was a silence full of shock and confusion. The faces that had been twisted in mocking smiles just a second ago were now frozen in blank surprise. Before the echo of the first heavy chord could fade away, her fingers were already moving. They were not plunking out notes one by one. They were flying. They moved like a swarm of angry bees, or like water rushing over a waterfall after a storm. The music was fast. It was incredibly fast. The notes tumbled over each other in a chaotic yet beautiful rush. The people in the audience stopped looking at their phones. They stopped whispering to each other. Their eyes went wide. Their jaws dropped open. They were hearing something that required immense skill and strength. This was not a simple folk song. It was a complex and difficult piece that only the most talented pianists in the world would dare to attempt in front of a crowd. It was confusing to watch. The woman still looked small and fragile in her old coat. Her hair was still in a messy bun. Her shoes were still worn and scuffed. But her hands were possessed by a demon of talent. Her left hand jumped across the lower keys, creating a heavy, rhythmic thumping that you could feel in your chest, while her right hand danced on the higher keys like a spider spinning a web. The contrast was jarring to the senses. The brain struggled to connect what the eyes were seeing with what the ears were hearing. The eyes saw a poor old woman, who looked like she needed help, crossing the street. The ears heard a master musician with the power of a giant. The disconnect made the audience feel dizzy. They realized, with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, that they had made a terrible mistake. A man in the third row, who had been laughing the loudest, slowly put his hand down. He forgot to blink. He stared at her fingers, trying to understand how they could move that fast. A woman near the aisle stopped, checking her reflection in her compact mirror. She turned fully toward the stage, and her mouth formed a perfect O shape. The arrogance drained out of the room like water from a bathtub. It was replaced by a growing sense of awe. No one could look away now. The performance had grabbed them by the throat and refused to let go. The music was intense and dramatic. It swelled and grew louder, then softer, then loud again. It told a story of struggle and pain and triumph that resonated with the humble woman playing it. She hit a long run of notes that required her fingers to stretch and cross over each other in complex patterns. A lesser player would have stumbled. A lesser player would have hit wrong notes. But she did not miss a single one. Her accuracy was terrifyingly perfect. The sound was clear and crisp. Every note stood out like a pearl on a string. The power behind the playing was immense. She was not treating the instrument gently. She was attacking it with love and fury. She was making the piano sing and scream and cry all at the same time. The vibrations filled the entire hall. The audience could feel the music in their bones. It was a physical experience. The mocking faces were gone. In their place were faces of total amazement and disbelief. The woman leaned into the piano as she played. Her body swayed with the rhythm of the music. She was lost in the sound. She forgot about the crowd. She forgot about her coat. She forgot about the mocking and the judgment. She was only a vessel for the music flowing through her. The intensity on her face was beautiful to watch. Her eyes were closed tight, and her lips were pressed together in deep concentration. She looked like a completely different person now. The frailty was gone, replaced by a fierce and burning energy. The people watching began to feel a strange mix of emotions. It was a heavy cocktail of guilt and respect. They felt guilty for judging her by her clothes. They felt respect for her obvious and undeniable genius. The air in the room had completely changed. It was no longer a place of judgment and social hierarchy. It was a place of worship. The music continued to build toward a high point. The speed increased even more. The volume grew until it filled every corner of the space. It was a storm that was getting stronger and stronger. The audience sat on the very edge of their seats. They were afraid to breathe lest they miss a single note. The silence of the crowd was absolute now. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. No one checked their phone. The only sound in the world was the thunder of the piano and the roaring of the music. They were witnessing a miracle. They were witnessing a humble woman, proving every single one of them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. And she was not even halfway done. The music changed direction, and the heavy thundering sounds from the beginning began to fade away like a storm moving out to sea, leaving behind a calm and quiet sky. Her hands moved with a gentleness that was surprising to witness after seeing such power only moments ago. She was no longer hitting the keys with force, but was now caressing them as if they were fragile baby birds. The notes that came out were soft and delicate, and they floated up into the high ceiling of the hall like soap bubbles drifting in the wind. It was a melody that felt like a sad memory or a dream from long ago. The contrast was jarring to the people listening, because they had just witnessed a display of raw strength, and now they were witnessing a display of incredible tenderness. It showed them that this woman was not just a machine of speed, but a human being with a deep and complicated soul. The audience sat completely still, and the silence in the room was so deep that you could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Every person was focused entirely on the stage. They were not thinking about their money or their jobs or the fancy dinner they planned to eat later. Their minds were empty of everything except the sound filling the air. The music had a story to tell, and it was speaking to them directly. It spoke of loneliness and of hope. It spoke of hard work and of love that lasts forever. A wealthy woman in the front row, who had been checking her diamond necklace only 10 minutes ago, now found herself wiping a tear from her cheek. She did not care about her makeup running down her face. She did not care about how she looked. She only cared about the beautiful sound coming from the old woman on the stage. The woman playing the piano had her eyes closed again, and her face was tilted slightly upward toward the bright lights. She looked peaceful in a way that seemed impossible for someone living such a hard life on the outside. The wrinkles on her face seemed to smooth out as the music took over her expression. She was not in a concert hall full of rich people anymore. She was somewhere else in her mind, perhaps in a memory from her childhood, or maybe in a place where only music exists. She swayed very slowly back and forth. Her body moved with the rhythm naturally, like a tree branch moving in the breeze. The heavy coat she wore looked less like a rag and more like a royal robe because of the way she carried herself. The dignity she radiated was powerful. It was a quiet dignity that demanded respect. Without saying a single word, the people watching began to feel a strange feeling in their chests. It was a mixture of guilt and awe. They looked at the woman, and they realized how wrong they had been to judge her. They had looked at her clothes and her shoes, and they had decided she was nothing. They had laughed at her. They had made cruel jokes. But now, as they listened to the most beautiful music many of them had ever heard, they felt small. They felt foolish for thinking that appearance was the same as worth. The music was teaching them a lesson that no sermon could ever teach. It was showing them that true value comes from the inside, and that talent and spirit can live in the most unexpected places. A young man in the back, who had recorded a video on his phone to mock her, slowly lowered his device. He stopped recording. He felt ashamed. He just stood there and let the music wash over him. The melody continued to weave through the air, and it became more complex as time went on. Her left hand started to play a rolling pattern that sounded like waves crashing on a beach, while her right hand played a high tune that sounded like a seagull crying. The two parts fit together perfectly. It was magic how she could control both hands to do such different things at the same time. It required a brain that worked faster than normal and a connection between the heart and the fingers that takes a lifetime to build. The sound was rich and full and warm. It filled the empty spaces in the hall and touched the cold walls, making the room feel cozy and alive. The acoustics of the building caught every sound and amplified it so that it felt like the music was surrounding the audience from all sides. People stopped crossing their arms and uncrossed their legs. They leaned forward. They wanted to be closer to the sound. They wanted to absorb every bit of it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely from hostile to reverent. It was as if a spell had been cast over the crowd. No one dared to speak or even cough. They were afraid that making a noise would break the magic and the woman would stop playing. The connection between the performer and the listeners was tangible. It was a thick rope of emotion that tied them all together. For the first time all evening, the wealthy audience members were not thinking about themselves. They were thinking about the woman on the bench. They were wondering about her life. They were wondering where she learned to play like that. They were wondering who she really was under that old coat. She played a series of chords that climbed higher and higher like a person climbing a mountain. The tension in the music grew again. It was not the angry tension from the start, but a tension full of longing and reaching. It made the audience hold their breath without realizing it. Their hearts beat a little faster, in sync with the rhythm. The anticipation was building. They could sense that she was leading them somewhere important. She was taking them on a journey, and they were willing passengers. The transformation of the evening was complete. The mockery had evaporated. The judgment had disappeared. There was only the music and the woman who was creating it out of thin air. She was proving to them that she was not just a humble woman. She was a giant. She was a master, and she was shocking them with every note she played. The volume began to rise slowly again, like the sun coming up over the horizon. Her fingers pressed down harder on the keys, and the sound grew bolder and stronger. It was not a loud noise for the sake of being loud. It was a triumphant sound. It was the sound of someone overcoming great odds. It was the sound of victory. The audience could feel the power returning, but this time, they welcomed it. They did not cover their ears. They opened their souls to it. They were ready for whatever she was going to do next. The woman on the stage was no longer an outsider to them. She was the center of their world. Her humble clothes were forgotten. Her age was forgotten. There was only the art, and it was breathtakingly beautiful. The music surged forward, carrying everyone along with it towards a conclusion that they knew would be powerful. They were hooked. They were hers. And she was just getting started. The music rushed forward like a river breaking through a dam, and her hands were moving across the keys with a speed that was hard for the eye to follow. It was a blur of motion. The sound was deafening, but it was a beautiful noise. It was not chaotic. Every note was clear and sharp, even though there were so many of them happening all at once. The audience was completely paralyzed by the spectacle. They sat gripping the armrests of their velvet chairs. Their knuckles were white. They felt the rhythm in their chests beating in time with the heavy bass notes. It felt like their own hearts were playing the music. The woman on the bench was sweating. Now, a small drop of perspiration rolled down her temple, but she did not wipe it away. She was entirely focused. She was pouring her entire life force into this final moment. The energy coming from the small stage was massive. It filled the entire hall like a rising tide. It was impossible to look away. The grand piano was singing under her fingers. It was weeping and rejoicing all at the same time. The complexity of the music was beyond anything the critics in the room had heard in years. It was raw and it was real. Then she lifted her hands high above her head one last time. For a split second, everything was suspended. In time, her hands paused at the peak of their arc. The audience held their breath so hard that some people started to feel dizzy. The anticipation in the air was a physical weight that pressed down on everyone. Then she brought them down hard on the keys. She struck the final chord. It was a massive sound that seemed to crack the air in two. The notes rang out loud and strong, and then she pulled her hands away instantly. She let the sound hang in the air. She let it fade away naturally, on its own, without rushing it. The silence that followed was the loudest silence they had ever heard. It was heavy and thick. It was the kind of silence that happens after a great storm passes, when the birds are too scared to sing. No one moved. No one spoke. It lasted for 3 long seconds. The sound of the piano still echoed in their ears. The vibration still tickled their skin. They were stunned. They were processing what they had just witnessed. It was as if they had seen a ghost or an angel. The transition from the roaring music to the absolute quiet was shocking to their systems. It left them breathless. Then the applause started. It did not start slowly. It exploded. It was like a dam breaking or a bomb going off, but in a good way. The first person to stand was a man in the very back row. He jumped to his feet and started clapping his hands together so hard they turned red. Then the front row stood up. Then the balcony. Within seconds, the entire concert hall was on its feet. The sound of 1,000 hands clapping was like a heavy rain falling on a metal roof. People were whistling and shouting bravo. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes with handkerchiefs. Others were just shaking their heads in disbelief. The mockery from the beginning of the night was completely gone. It had been replaced by a thunderous admiration. The people who had laughed at her coat were now clapping the loudest. They were clapping to apologize. They were clapping because they had been humbled. They realized that they had been in the presence of greatness, and they had almost missed it because of their own pride. The noise was deafening. It washed over the stage like a wave of love and respect that the woman had probably never experienced before in her life. The woman sat on the bench for a moment looking out at the standing crowd. Her chest was heaving up and down as she caught her breath. She looked surprised by the reaction. A shy smile appeared on her face. It was a small and genuine smile that reached her eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. She did not stand up and take a bow like a movie star. She did not raise her arms in victory. She just sat there for a moment, looking at the people who had judged her so harshly only 20 minutes ago. There was no anger in her face. She did not look smug. She did not seem to be thinking, "I told you so." She just looked happy that they had enjoyed the music. It was a pure and simple joy that comes from sharing a gift. She looked at her hands as if she was surprised they belonged to her. Then she slowly stood up from the piano bench. She smoothed down her old coat with her hands and patted her hair to make sure it was still in place. She walked to the center of the stage and gave a quick and clumsy little bow. It was not a formal bow from the waist. It was just a nod of her head and a slight bend of her knees. It was the bow of a humble person who is grateful for the chance to be heard. She did not wait for the applause to stop. She did not come back for an encore. She turned around and walked back to where she had put her cloth bag. She picked it up and slung it over her shoulder. Just like that, she was ready to leave. She walked off the stage the same way she had walked onto it, with slow and steady steps. As she disappeared behind the heavy velvet curtain, the applause grew even louder. People were screaming for her to come back, but she did not return. The lights on the stage dimmed. The audience was left standing there looking at the empty piano bench. The spell was broken, but the feeling remained. The atmosphere in the hall was completely different now. The arrogance had been sucked out of the room. As people began to file out of the doors, they were talking in hushed, excited tones. They were not talking about their business deals or their expensive cars. They were talking about the music. They were talking about the woman in the faded coat. They wondered who she was. They wondered where she came from. And every single one of them walked out of that building feeling a little bit smaller and a little bit more humble. They had learned a lesson that they would never forget. They had learned that true talent does not wear a tuxedo. They had learned that you should never mock someone just because they look different. The evening had ended, but the memory of the performance would stay with them for the rest of their lives.